Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle. Today I'm going to be walking you through my pre-assessment of the British Columbia Chinook salmon fishery. This presentation is going to summarize my research through the lens of just the MSC Marine Stewardship Council Sustainability Framework, exploring whether or not the ecological, economic, management dimensions for this fishery are well attained and in place, so that way it can be certified or not certified. So the fishery I chose is the British Columbia Chinook salmon fishery. As you can imagine, there's many salmon fisheries that are around the world, different parts of the world. Don't mind me, I got a little head cold going on. But the British Columbia Chinook salmon fishery is not certified currently. There are fisheries in Alaska that are certified. There are fisheries in California that were certified, but pulled. But the British Columbia Chinook salmon fishery is not certified. So I chose that fishery specifically for that reason, obviously, as we needed one that was not certified, but also because it faces a lot of systemic problems that we're going to go through just briefly in this presentation. So you may be wondering why Chinook. Out of all Pacific salmon species, Chinook, coho, pink, chum, Chinook face the largest ecological threat. They're also the most culturally significant of Pacific salmon species to indigenous nations, which we'll talk about later on this PowerPoint, but also for anglers alike, something I can attest to. It's what got me into my love of fishery biology, is fishing for these fish, to be honest with you. But beside that, the stocks are declining across British Columbia and Alaska, the coast of California, throughout the whole coast of the Pacific. Stocks of Chinook are on the decline. Um, that's masked somewhat by hatchery populations, which we'll talk about again later in this presentation. But the wild populations themselves are the ones that are facing the biggest threat. So Chinook play a keystone role in ecosystems and coastal communities. They are simiparous, which we'll get to in a minute, but they only spawn once in their life, as do all Pacific salmon species. So that is a huge importance in their life history, right? They only get the mate and spawn once. So in order for that to be successful, in order for those young to hatch and rear, it's going to need a vibrant and healthy, resilient ecosystem. Um, so just a quick little couple little fun facts about the biology and physiology, phenology, I guess, of the fish. They have dark mouths and gums. You can tell the difference between a king Chinook salmon and a coho, specifically just right away by the gums. Chinooks have black, dark gums, and coho have white. um, they're also going to have this spot along the vertical line. Um, so that's something too, but that can also change with their life history. So they can start changing color and morphology and all that other things when they're spawning in later life history stages. So the main easiest way to tell them apart is through the color of the gums. So yeah, like we said here, no MC certification, despite this high ecological and economic value. Um, let's move on here to the next one. So this is just a little map of the area that's in question. We're talking now this Yukon River watershed in Canada. This is just showing all of these offshoots and streams and runs that these fish, wild spawning fish, go up to then hatch and rear and do that life history phases that we're talking about. So this area is the area that's really managed very tightly. You can see the boundary here between the Gulf of Alaska and then British Columbia, and then these borders and boundaries. So what's going to delineate, like it says, commercial and domestic boundaries of fishing. All right, so let's get into some of the little analytics here. So the target species background. So the framework is built on three principles. We know that: sustainable fisheries, maintaining a healthy stock, minimizing the ecosystem impacts, ensuring the effective management. So we're going to look over all that really quickly. But first and foremost, the background of Chinook. So like we were saying, they have an anadromous life cycle, semiparous reproduction, only spawning once before they die. Um, Obviously, they're like other Pacific salmon species, they're migrating for that reproduction. They're going to be leaving those freshwater watersheds, going out into the ocean, you know, spending a few 3 or 4 or 5 years coming back and migrating then back upstream to mate and spawn. Southern populations of the British Columbia uh, fish stocks have been listed as threatened. So that is based off of COSWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, which we'll again talk about again in a minute with one of the species that interplays with Chinook in an interspecies connection. So the management tools that they use are PBT, GSI. A newer one is eDNA. We have PBT, which is parentage-based tagging. So that's a genetic tagging method. GSI, which is genetic stock identification, which is how they're going to determine fish populations through DNA comparisons of the fish themselves. And then a newer one, which is eDNA, which is environmental DNA, which is pretty cool, which we've talked about in some of the discussions with some classmates. The cases, just kind of a growing field, is taking trace amounts of DNA found in samples and then figuring out from that sample of DNA, what's been there, what's migrating, what's present, what's not present, and connecting the dots from there, which is a very simplistic way of putting it. But yeah, you're detecting species based off of the DNA that's found. And so we'll again talk about that in a minute when I show you another figure. But continued pressure from warming, competition, those hatchery stocked fish that we talked about a minute ago are big problems for Chinook wild populations. So if we look over here at this figure from my first source, which was Connors et al., we see a change in sea surface temperature in the North Pacific compared to the Bering Sea and the British Columbia coast. So we can see clearly here the rise after 2000, which is shot straight up in the North Pacific, compared to the Bering Sea, which is falling, and the British Columbia coast, which is falling. So we'll talk about that again when we look back on it, but this is a sea surface temperature anomalies for these areas. And so you might be asking yourself, well, it's getting warmer over here, but colder over here. What's going on? Well, one of the main things I address in my paper is how these fish are moving locations of where they're going to stay and spawn and mate before they go, rear essentially. So I'm trying to say, so they're going to find these places that they're going to move to, but the water temperatures are better in favor for their, life history stage. They're not going to hang around where it's not suitable. So this is just showing the shifts then in stocks and where they're going, which we'll get to. So the background, again, which we're looking at, is just some of the numbers pulled right from the database. Chinook are showing extremely low numbers compared to sockeye and pink of catch, right? These are catch numbers, catch and spawning, returning to North American watersheds over almost 100-year time frame. So if you look, right, it's dominated by pink, and we can see chum, sockeye, right, all the way down the bottom. So this just highlights the severe disparity between Chinook and other Pacific salmon species within the same fishery. So now let's get into another couple cool examples of eDNA. So if we look over here, I'm just pulling up some of my notes because this one gets a little tricky. So obviously, first and foremost, risks of the ecosystem and pressures, bycatch risks, entanglements from gill nets, right? Right away, if we just dial back real quick and we look at the numbers of caught fish, right, we can see sockeye and pink are way up there versus Chinook. So when fleets are out fishing for these fish, they're not necessarily, worried about what fish get caught up in those nets when they're fishing for similar species of fish. So that's a huge risk, but also other species. One of the papers that I have in here highlights alplid species, so marine bird species that are caught up in the nets and also facing intense pressure from these fisheries and the fishing types. But one of the main points is dependent species. So southern resident killer whales, they're also identified by COSWIC, the Committee of Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, is one of the main species that interplays with Chinook out in the wild. So um, southern resident killer whales depend on Chinook for about 80% of their diet. So that's a huge amount. Four-fifths of their diet comes from these fish, and you can imagine if the numbers aren't there in wild populations, right? A wild population of marine mammal, an apex predator, cannot rely on hatchery fish for its diet, 80% of its diet at that, to sustain itself in the long term. So that's a problem. Let's go back here. So many links in the food chain that have been exposed with eDNA technology. Just in this figure to the right from Deeg et al. In their paper was talking about how all of these connections from different species can have a huge cost or pro con benefit to the Chinook species as a whole. So what this figure is showing us right here, the dots are representing trace samples of eDNA for said organism or species. And the darker, larger the dot, the circle, the more DNA that was found. So on the top here, we have a couple copepods. Middle, we have a couple lanternfish. We have jellyfish. Um, and then down here, we have a porpoise. And it was said that if this fish was found, there was a representation of a healthy ecosystem. So this was a predator to king salmon. So obviously, the copepods they're feeding on in juvenile life history stages. They need these fish. They need these organisms so that way the fish can grow. These are a main source of diet in juvenile stages. Getting older, they're feeding on a little bit larger of prey, and then healthy, healthy. What am I trying to say? A healthy, not target, but a representation of the ecosystem with this um, larger predator. So that just goes to show how new technology is being used to show the interplays and the interconnectedness of the ecosystem with the species that I've targeted. So with that said, habitat protection, they're trying to put in place selective measures on gears, seasonal closures, restoration of certain habitats to try to mitigate and minimize these pressures that these animals and these organisms face. Um, so let's look now a little bit closer at the management and governance part. So despite a bunch of management sophistication, warming oceans, hatchery competition, all this other stuff, there's a ton of inter not interplay. There's a ton of innovation, I guess you could say, between the different management sectors. So DFO, which is Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have their IFMP, which is their Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, and inside of that, they lay out exactly who is involved with every aspect of the management plan. So they have Indigenous nations, which is what I mentioned before, which play a big role, which I'm going to get to in a few minutes at the end of my opinion, which I think they should play just a little bit bigger of a role because we're going to look at that evidence from the past. But the Indigenous nations, things like the PSC, which is the Pacific Salmon Committee Commission, they have Pacific Salmon Treaty, which is just frameworks in place, the Wild Salmon Policy, AFS, which is the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, which lays out some of that partnership planning with Indigenous nations. And then for enforcement, they have, just like any other fishery would, they have observers that go out, dockside validation, but then also because of the involvement with the Indigenous program and nations, they have guardian programs, Indigenous guardian programs, which serve very similar to observers that we would have in our fisheries here. But looking a little bit closer at the strategies that were used. So if we look at this figure over here to the right from Atlas, Atlas et al. 2021, their paper, which highlighted the similarities and differences between indigenous management systems and just contemporary regular fisheries management systems that we see today. So they lay this out. I really like the way that they lay this out. So I'm just going to take a second to just break it down. They show at the bottom here, a risk assessment between low and high risk, and then left and right, traditional, and then we have the contemporary. I'm sorry, contemporary management systems. So on the right here, we see contemporary management systems, right? Top down, federal policy that comes from science and technical staff, resource managers. It's just this chain of command, right? So we get information passed up, information passed down. It's awesome. It gets down to the bottom where, right, you actually have it being put in place with the fleet set going out and they're fishing in mixed stock fisheries, right? That also, right, happens here, but this paper is focusing on, right, Pacific salmon and Chinook. So we're going to focus on obviously that for the sake of what we're talking about. But indigenous systems, right, which is why I'm bringing that up, focus distinctly, like it says, on these distinct runs. So to my point, I guess what I'm trying to say is why I think that we should focus a little bit more on integrating the indigenous leadership and management systems. I think it would work a little bit better if we could pull from some of that over here into the mixed stocks. So essentially what they're using, right, is these mixed stock harvest risks, right? So these species that have distinct runs and spawn timing of habitat, right? A contemporary management system is a very high risk on something that is a distinct run, right? So that there's a very high risk placed on that. The catch stability, right, is very low on this side, but it's very high on this side, right? Local governance, right, is very high for the indigenous, it's very high on the fishery selectivity, it's very high on the resilience. So what is that showing us? Well, just by looking at this picture, which we're going to see another figure from this in a second, just by looking at this picture, we can see that traditional indigenous native management systems place a high priority on the selectivity of the fishery, the ecological and social resilience, the governance, right? And they don't place as high of a priority on the catch stability or the mixed stock harvest risks, right? So how does that play out? How does that make sense? Well, if they're fishing for Chinook salmon, right, and they're coming through this migratory pattern, this route, like we said, they're going to have to place these things we just laid out on that, so that way it can then work out in the long run, right? You can't have low fishery selectivity on a fish that's migrating, right? And it's semiparis, meaning it only has the ability to spawn once and not be selecting for that fish when you're fishing for it, right? So let's look now just quickly at the next one, which is how they did this, right? So we're going to jump right into the methods that they used. So they use these things like weirs, fish traps, reef nets, dip nets, fish wheels. And this is how they managed the fish. So looking back really quickly, right? They used this on the left, right? So local governance is high, fishery selectivity is high, social ecological resilience is high, right? Now, what does that play out into, right? So they're literally, like it says here, building fences that will channel these salmon into a trap, right? Like we see here, they're out with reef nets, obviously in a much smaller vessel, capturing migrating fish, right? Exactly when they know they're coming through that migratory route. Um, fish, sorry, fish wheels, right, are stationary, just exactly what it sounds like, almost like a water wheel. The stationary technology that's just sitting there and then, catching the fish, moving them up. Um, so what I'm trying to say is they're placing a high priority on these um, traditional systems, which is leading to a long-term resilience. Whereas in a contemporary management system, we're placing a high priority on the risk of a mixed stock fishery and a high priority on the catch stability, right? And we're not placing that high priority on the local governance, selectivity of the fishery, or the resilience. And where's that getting us, right? That's getting us, like no pun intended, out in the open, stranded, right? Because we're not worried about selecting for that certain fish. We're just out in a mixed stock fishery pulling and plunging. So that's a problem. Um, so looking at the stakeholders, right, we have a broad set of consultation committees, management systems, frameworks from the indigenous sector to government to NGO, non-governmental organizations to academic stakeholders everywhere. A big part of the work being done on that map that we looked at is some of the colleges and universities right in British Columbia in the Yukon River watershed. They're doing a lot of work, um, a lot of data research on those fronts. So last but not least, let's look at some of the quick critical challenges. So climate-driven ocean change, like we said, is definitely a huge problem. The sea surface temperature is rising, fish are moving, and they're changing their location of where they once were, which is obviously going to be a problem for the life history and the life cycle of the fish. So hatchery versus wild competition, masking declines, like we said, and then the southern populations collapse despite evident. Um, the southern population is collapsing, is evident despite the management. And so we're going to look at this figure right here really quickly and just go and compare now over here to our sea surface temp, right? So North Pacific, it's getting a lot warmer, right? British Columbia, it's actually just stabilizing. So what's happening now, right? Commercial harvests of all five Pacific salmon species, and over the last roughly 100 years, from 1925 to 23, in the 5-year running averages. We look now at U.S. West Coast, right? It's been completely almost decimated. So the first thing we look at is the U.S. West Coast in Canada, and it's gone down. So if the North Pacific is rising in temperature and these commercial harvests are going down, well, that's a strict correlation between the two, right? And then we see over here that the catch numbers in Russia and Alaska are actually heightening, right? So what's going on? Fish are moving was what seems like it's what's happening. So my opinion and my outlook on the whole thing is I think that we need to strengthen selective harvest and enforcement zones, especially on the West Coast and the North Pacific of, British Columbia and California. Um, my target of this certification and this assessment is British Columbia's fishery. So for that reason, I'm going to say that in the British Columbia um, Chinook salmon fishery, they should focus on a little bit more of the selective harvest and working with the indigenous management strategies they already have in place. So I would expect them to build upon that and invest in, like I have here, habitat restoration and monitoring, so that way they can swap out those zones and the timing of fishing. Um, right? So obviously that's going to be hard because of the life cycle of the fish again, but they're going to have to find a way so that way they can mitigate the pressures that not only the fish are facing, but the other organisms within the ecosystem are facing, right? So with that, I think the certification is achievable, but in the near term, through adaptive inclusive management, I think it's going to take some work. Um, so with that said, that's my opinions, and I'm going to say thank you. If you can't tell, I'm a fish fanatic myself, and that's what got me here in the first place. So thank you all, and I look forward to your opinions and your feedback. And I hope you guys had a great semester and a great class like I did.